Professor von Dusen's Problems by Jacques Futrelle. Number 3. The Green-Eyed Monster. With coffee cup daintily poised in one hand, Mrs. Langard van Safford lifted wistfully, bewitching eyes towards her husband, who sat across the breakfast table, particularly immersed in the morning paper. "Are you going out this morning?" Mr. Van Safford grunted inarticulately. "May I inquire," she went on placidly, through dimple snuggled at her corner of her mouth, "if that particular grunt means that you are or are not?" Mr. Van Safford lowered his newspaper and glanced at his wife's pretty face. She smiled charmingly. "Really, I beg your pardon," he apologized. "I hardly think I shall go out. I feel rather listless, and I must write some letters." "Why?" "Oh, nothing particularly," she responded. She took the last sip of her coffee and brushed 2 or 3 tiny crumbs from her lap and laid her servlettes aside and rose. Once she turned and glanced back, Mr. Van Safford was reading again. After a while, he finished the papers and stood looking out the window, yawning prodigiously at the prospect of letters to be written. His wife entered and picked up her handkerchief, which she had fallen beside her chair. He merely glanced around. She was dressed for the street, immaculately gowned as only a young and beautiful woman can gown herself. "Where are you going, my dear?" he inquired languidly. "Out," she responded archly. She passed through the door. He heard her step and then rustle of her skirts in the hall, and he heard the front door open and close. For some reason, not quite clear even to himself, it surprised him. She had never done a thing like that before. He walked to the front window and looked out. His wife went straight down the street and turned the first corner. After a time, he wandered away to the library to nurse an emotion he had never felt before. It was curiosity. Mrs. Van Safford did not return home for luncheon, so he sat down alone. Afterwards, he wandered restlessly about the house for an hour or so, and then he went downtown. He appeared at home again just in time to dress for dinner. "Has Mrs. Van Safford returned?" was the first question of Baxter, who opened the door. "Yes, an hour and a half ago," he responded. "She's dressing." Mr. Van Safford ran up the stairs to his own apartments. At dinner, his wife was radiant, rosily radiant. The flush of perfect health was in her cheeks, and her eyes sparkled beneath her long lashes. Her husband brilliantly smiled. She brilliantly smiled upon her husband. To him, it was as if some great thing had been taken out of his life, leaving it desolate, then as suddenly returned. Unnamed emotions struggled within him, prompted by that curiosity of the morning, and a dozen questions hammered insistently for expression. But he repressed them gallantly, for this was his duly reward. "I had such a good time today," his wife exclaimed after the soup. "I called for Mrs. Braddock immediately after I left here, and we went together to the day's shopping, and we had luncheon downtown." "Oh, that was it?" Mr. Safford laughed outright, from a vague sense of relief, which he could not have called by name. He toasted his wife silently and lifting his glass. Her eyes sparkled at the compliment. The glass raised, he snapped the slender stems in his fingers, laughed again, and laid it aside. Mrs. Van Safford dimpled with sheer delight. "Oh, Van, you silly boy," she reproved softly, and she stroked the hand which was prosaically reaching for the salt. It was only a little while after dinner that Mr. Van Safford excused himself and started for the club, as usual. His wife followed him demurely to the door, and there, under the googling eyes of Baxter, he caught her in his arms and kissed her impetuously, fiercely even. It was a sudden outbreak of an impulsive nature, the sort of thing that makes a woman know she is loved. She thrilled at his touch and reached two white hands forward pleadingly. Then the door closed, and she stood staring down at the tip of her tiny boot with lowered lids, and her little melancholy droop at her shoulders and her mouth. It was after 10 o'clock when Mr. Van Safford awoke on the following morning. He had been at his club late, until after 2, and now drowsily permitted himself to be overcome again by the languid listlessness which is the heritage of late hours. At 10 minutes past 11 he appeared in the breakfast room. "Mrs. Van Safford has been down, I suppose?" he asked the maid.
"Oh, yes, sir," she replied. "She's gone out."
Mr. Van Safford lifted his brows inquiringly.
"She was down a few minutes after 8 o'clock, sir," the maid exclaimed, "and hurried through her breakfast."
"Did she leave any word?"
"No, sir."
"Be back at luncheon?"
"She didn't say, sir."
Mr. Van Safford finished his breakfast silently and thoughtfully. About noon he too went out. One of the first persons he met downtown was Mrs. Blacklock, and she rushed forward to him with an outstretched hand.
"I'm so glad to see you,"
she bubbled, for Mrs. Blacklock was that rare type that can bubble becomingly.
"But where in the name of goodness is your wife? I haven't seen her for weeks. For weeks."
"Haven't seen her for—" Mr. Van Safford repeated slowly.
"No,"
Miss Blacklock assured him.
"I can't imagine where she's keeping herself."
Mr. Van Safford gazed at her in dumb bewilderment for a moment, and the lines about his mouth hardened a little, despite his efforts to control himself. "I had the impression," he said deliberately, "that you saw her yesterday and that you went shopping together."
"Oh, goodness, no. It must have been 3 weeks since I've seen her."
Mr. Van Safford's fingers crossed slowly, fiercely, but his face relaxed a little, masking, with a slight smile, a turbulent rush of mingled emotions. "She mentioned your name," he said at last calmly. "Perhaps she said she was going to call you. I misunderstood her." He didn't remember the remainder of the conversation, but it was of no consequence at the moment. He had not misunderstood her, and he knew he had not. At last he found himself at his club, and their idle guesses and conjectures flowed through his brain in an unending stream. Finally, he arose grimly. "I suppose I'm an ass," he mused. "It doesn't amount to anything, of course, but—" And he caught himself... And he sought to rid himself of distracting thoughts over a game of billiards. Instead, he only subjected himself to open derision for glaringly inaccurate play. Finally, he flung down the cue in disgust and strode away to the phone and called up his home. "Is Mrs. Van Safford there?" he inquired of Baxter.
"No, sir, she hasn't returned yet."
Mr. Van Safford banged the telephone viciously as he hung up the receiver. At 6 o'clock he returned home. His wife was still out. At 8:30 he sat down to dinner, alone. He did not enjoy it, indeed hardly taste it. Just as he finished, she came in with a rush of skirts and a lit of laughter. He drew a long breath and set his teeth.
"You poor deserted dear," she sympathized
laughingly. He started to say something, but 2 soft, clinging arms were about his neck, and a velvety cheek rested against his own. So he kissed her instead. And really, he was not at all to be blamed. She sighed happily and laid aside her hat and gloves.
"I simply couldn't get here any sooner," she explained poutingly as she glanced into his accusing eyes. I was out with Neil Blakesley on her big new touring car, and it broke down, and we had to send for a man to repair it. So
He did not hear the rest. He was staring into her eyes, steadily, inquiringly. Truth shone triumphant there. He could only believe her. Yet that other thing. She had not told him the truth. In her face, at least, he read uneasiness as he continued to stare. And there, for a moment, there was silence.
"What's the matter, Van?" she inquired solicitously. "Don't you feel well?"
He pulled himself together with a start, and for a time they chatted of inconsequential things as she ate. He watched her until she pushed a dessert plate aside, then casually, quite casually, "I believe you said that you were going to call on Mrs. Blaylock tomorrow." She looked up quickly.
"Oh, no," she replied. "I was with her all day yesterday, shopping. I said I had called on her."
Mr. von Safford rose suddenly, stood glaringly down at her for an instant, then, turning abruptly, left the house. Involuntarily she started up, then she sat down again and wept softly over her coffee. Mr. von Safford seemed to have had a very definite purpose, for when he reached the club he went straight to a telephone booth and called Miss Blakesley over the wire. "My wife said something about," he stammered lamely. "Something about calling you tomorrow. Will you be in?"
"Yes, and I shall be very glad to see her," came the reply. "I'm dreadfully tired of staying cooped up here in the house, and I really was beginning to think all my friends had deserted me."
"Cooped up in the house," came the reply. "Are you ill?"
"I have been," came the reply. "I'm better now, but I haven't been out of the house for more than a week."
"Indeed," remarked Mr. von Safford sympathetically. "I am awfully sorry to assure you. Then you haven't had a chance to try out your big new touring car?"
"Why, I haven't had any new touring car," said Miss Blakesley. "I haven't any sort of car. Where did you get that idea?"
Mr. von Safford did not answer her. Rudely enough, he hung up the telephone and left the club with a face like marble. When he finally stopped walking, he was opposite of his house. For a moment, he stood looking at it as much as he had never seen it before. Then he turned and went back to the club. There was something of fright, of horror even, in his white face when he entered. As Mr. von Safford did not go to bed that night, it was not surprising that his wife should find him in the breakfast room when she came down about 8 o'clock. She smiled, he stared at her in a curt good morning. Then came an ominous silence. She finished her breakfast, rose, and left the house without a word. He watched her from the window until she disappeared around the corner, just 4 doors below. Then, overcome with fears, suspicions, and hideous possibilities, he ran after her. She had not been out of his sight for more than half a minute when he reached the corner, and yet now she was gone. He looked on both sides of the street, up and down. There was no sign of her, not a woman in sight. He knew that she would not have had time to reach the street below, and in that case there were 2 obvious possibilities. One was that she had stepped into a waiting cab and had been driven away at full speed, another that she had entered some house nearby. If so, which house? Whom did she know on this street? He turned the problem over in his mind several times, and then he was convinced that she had hurried away in a waiting cab. That emotion which had begun his curiosity was now a raging, turbulent torrent. On the following morning, Mrs. Van Safford came down for breakfast at 15 minutes to 8. She seemed a little tired, and there was a trace of tears about her eyes. Baxter looked at her curiously.
"Has Mr. Van Stafford been down yet?"
she asked. "No, ma'am," he replied.
Did he come in at all last night?
Yes, madam. About 2:30 I let him in. He had forgotten his key. Now, as a matter of fact, at that particular moment, Mr. Von Safford was standing just around the corner, 4 doors down, waiting for his wife. Just what he intended to do when she appeared, he was not quite clear in his mind, but the affair had gone to a point where he felt that he must do something. So he waited impatiently and smoked innumerable cigars. 2 hours passed. He glanced around the corner. No one in sight. He strolled back to the house and met Baxter in the hall. "Has Miss Van Stafford come down?" he asked the servant. "Yes, sir," was the reply. "She went out more than an hour ago." Martha opened the door.
"Please, sir," she said, "there's a young gentleman having a fit in the reception room."
Professor Von Dusen, the thinking machine, turned away from his laboratory table and squinted at her aggressively. Her eyes were distended with nervous excitement, and her wrinkled hands twisted the apron she wore.
"Having a fit?"
snapped the scientist.
"Yes, sir." Dear me, how annoying," expostulated the man of achievements petulantly. "Just what sort of fit is it? Epileptic, apoplectic, or merely a fit of laughter?" "That, sir, I don't know," Martha confessed helplessly. "He's just a walking and a talking and pulling his hair, sir." "What name?" I forgot to ask, sir," apologized the aged servant. "It surprised me to see a gentleman a-wiggling like that. He said, though, he's been to a police headquarters and Detective Mallory sent him here."
The eminent logistician dried his hands and started for the reception room. At the door he paused and peered in, with no knowledge of just what style of fit the visitor had chosen to have. He felt the necessity for caution. What he saw was not alarming, merely a good-looking young man pacing back and forth across the room with quick, savage stride. His eyes were blazing, and his face was flushed with anger. It was Mr. Von Safford. At the sight of the diminutive figure of the thinking machine, topped by an enormous yellow head, the young man paused, and his anger-distorted features relaxed into something closely approaching surprise.
"Well?"
demanded the professor curiously. "I beg your pardon," said Mrs. Safford with a slight start. "I had expected to find a different sort of person."
"Yes, I know," said the thinking man grumpily. "A man with a black mustache and big feet. Sit down."
Mr. Von Safford sat down rather suddenly. It never occurred to anyone to do any other than obey the crabbed little scientist spoke. Then, with an incoherence which was thoroughly convincing, Mr. Von Safford led before the thinking machine and detailed those singular happenings which had so disturbed him. The professor leaned back in his chair, with fingertips pressed together, and listened to the end. "My mental condition, my suffering was such," explained Mr. Von Safford in conclusion, "that I was proved to have my own satisfaction that she had twice misrepresented facts to me, willfully. I could have strangled her."
"That would have been a nice thing to do," remarked the scientist crisply. "You believe, then, that there may be another?"
"Don't say it," burst out the young man passionately. He rose. His face was dead white. "Don't say it," he repeated menacingly. The thinking machine was silent a moment. Then he glanced up with blazing eyes and cleared his throat.
"Did she never did such a thing before?"
he asked. "No, never."
Did she ever speculate?"
Mr. Van Safford sat down again. "Never," he responded positively. "She wouldn't know one stock from another."
"Has her own bank account?"
"Yes, nearly $400,000. That was her father's gift at her wedding. It was deposited in her name and has remained so. My own income is more than enough for our uses."
"You're a rich man, then?"
"My father left me nearly $2 million, was his reply. But all this doesn't matter. What I want..."
Wait a minute, interrupted the thinking machine testily. There was a long pause. You have never quarreled seriously?
Never a cross word, was the reply.
Remarkable, commented the thinking machine ambiguously. How long have you been married?
2 years. Last June.
Most remarkable, supplemented the scientist.
Mr. von Safford stared.
How old are you?
30.
How long have you been 30?
6 months, since last May. There was a long pause. Mr. Van Safford plainly did not see the trend of the questioning.
How old is your wife? Demanded the scientist.
22, in January.
She has never had any mental trouble of any sort?
No.
Have you any brothers or sisters?
No.
Has she?
No. The thinking machine shot out the questions crustily, and Mr. Van Safford answered briefly. There was another pause, and the young man arose and paced back and forth with nervous energy. From time to time he glanced inquiringly at the pale, wizened face of the scientist. Several thin lines had appeared in the dome-like brow, and he was apparently oblivious to the other's presence.
It's a most tangible, elusive affair, he commented at last, and the wrinkles deepened. It is, I may say, a problem without given quantity. Perfectly extraordinary.
Mr. von Safford seemed a little relieved to find someone express his own thoughts so accurately.
You don't believe, of course, continued the scientist, that there is anything criminal in...
Certainly not, the young man said violently.
Yet the moment we pursue to logical exclusion, pursued the other, we are more than likely to uncover something which is, to put it mildly, not pleasant.
Mr. von Safford's face was perfectly white. His hands were clenched desperately. Then the loyalty to the woman he loved flooded his heart. It's nothing of that kind, he exclaimed, and yet his own heart misgave him. My wife is the dearest, noblest, sweetest woman in the world, and yet...
Yet you are jealous of her,
interrupted the thinking machine.
If you are so sure of her, why annoy me with your troubles?
The young man read, perhaps, a deeper meaning than the thinking machine had intended, for he started forward impulsively. The professor continued to squint at him impersonally, but did not change his position.
All young men are fools, he went on blandly, and I may add to the most that the old ones are too. But now the question is, what purpose can your wife have in acting as she did, and in misrepresenting those acts to you? Of course, we must spy on her to find out. The answer may be one that may wreck your future happiness. It may be, I say. I don't know. Do you still want the answer?
I want to know, burst Mr. Van Safford harshly. I shall go mad unless I know. The thinking machine continued to squint at him, with almost a gleam of pity in his eyes. Almost, but not quite. And the habitually irritated voice was in no way softened when he gave some explicit and definite instructions.
Go on about your affairs, he commanded. Let things go as they are. Don't quarrel with your wife. Continue to ask your questions, because if you don't, she'll suspect that you suspect. Report to me any change of her conduct. It's a very singular problem. Certainly have never had another like it.
The thinking machine accompanied him to the door, and closed it behind him.
I have never seen a man in love, he mused, who wasn't in trouble.
And with this broad philosophical conclusion, he went to the phone. Half an hour later, Hutchinson Hatch, reporter, entered the laboratory where the scientist sat in deep thought.
Mr. Hatch, he began, without preliminary, did you ever happen to hear of Mr. and Mrs. Van Safford?
Well, rather, responded the reporter with quick interest. He's a well-known clubman, worth millions, high in society and all that, and she's one of the most beautiful women I ever saw. She was a Miss Porter before marriage.
It's wonderful the memories you newspapermen have, observed the scientist. You know her personally?
Hatch shook his head.
You must find someone who knows her well, commanded the thinking machine. A girlfriend, for instance, one who might be in her confidence. Learn from her why Miss Van Safford leaves her house every morning at 8 o'clock, and then tells her husband she has been with someone that we know she hasn't seen. She has done this every day for 4 days. Your absurdity may prevent a divorce.
Hatch pricked up his ears.
Also, find out just what sort of illness Miss Neil Blakesley has recently suffered. That's all.
An hour later, Hutchinson Hatch, reporter, called on Miss Gladys Beckman, a young society woman who was an intimate of Miss Van Safford's before the latter's marriage. Without feeling that he was dallying with the truth, Hatch informed her that he called on her behalf of Mr. Van Safford. She began to smile. He laid the case before her emphatically, earnestly, and with great detail. The more he explained, the more pleasantly she smiled. It made him uncomfortable, but he struggled on to the end.
I'm glad she did it, exclaimed Miss Beckman. I couldn't believe she would.
Then a sudden gust of laughter which left Hutchinson Hatch, reporter, with the feeling that he was being imposed upon. It continued for a full minute, hearty, rippling, musical laugh. Hatch grinned sheepishly, then without an excuse Miss Beekman rose and left the room. In the hall there came a fresh burst, and Hatch heard it dying away in the distance. "Well," he muttered grimly, "I'm glad I was able to amuse her." Then he called upon Mrs. Francis, a young matron whom he had cause to believe was also favored by Miss Van Stafford's friendship. He laid the case before her, and she laughed. Then Hutchinson Hatch, reporter, began to get mule-headed about it. He visited 8 other women who were known Yeah. 6 of them intimated that he was an impertinent, prying, inquisitive person, and the other 2 laughed. Hatch paused and stroked his fevered brow. "Here's a corking good joke on somebody," he told himself. "I'm beginning to think it's me." Whereupon he took his troubles to Professor von Dusen. That distinguished gentleman listened in pained surprise to the simple recital of what Hatch had not been able to learn. The spotted wrinkles on his forehead assumed the relative importance to the canals in Mars.
"It's astonishing,"
he declared restfully. "Yes, it struck me so," agreed the reporter. The thinking machine was silent for a long time. The watery blue eyes were turned upward, and the slender white fingers pressed tip to tip. Finally, he made up his mind as to the next step.
"There seems only one thing to do," he said, "and I won't ask you to do that."
"What is it?" demanded the reporter.
"To watch Mrs. Van Safford and see where she goes."
"I wouldn't have done it before, but now I will," Hatch responded promptly. The bulldog in him was aroused. "I want to see what the joke is." It was 10 o'clock next evening when Hatch called to make a report. He seemed a little weary and tremendously disgusted. "I've been right behind her all day," he explained, "from 8 o'clock this morning until 20 minutes past 9 tonight, when she reached home. And if the Lord will forgive me—"
"What did she do?"
interrupted Professor von Dusen impatiently. "Well," said Hutch, and grinned as he drew out his notebook. "She walked eastward from her house to the first corner, turned, walked another block, took a downtown car, and went straight to the public library. There she read a Henry James book until 15 minutes till 1, and then she went to see a luncheon at a restaurant. I also had luncheon. Then we went to the North End on a car. She got there after she wandered around aimlessly all afternoon, nearly. At 10 minutes to 4, she gave a quarter to a crippled boy. He bit it to see if it was good. She found it was, and bought cigarettes with it. 4:30, she left the North End and went to a big department store. If there's anything there she didn't price, I can't remember it. She bought a pair of shoelaces. The store closed at 6, so she went to dinner at another restaurant. I also had dinner. We left there at 7:30 and went past the public library. She read until 9 o'clock, and then she went home. Phew," he concluded. The thinking machine had listened with growing and obvious disappointment in his face. He seemed to cast down the recital that Hatch began to feel guilty. I couldn't help it, you know, the reporter said by way of apology. That's what she did.
She didn't speak to anyone?
Not a soul but clerks, waiters, and library attendants.
She didn't give a note to anyone or receive a note?
No.
Did she seem to have any purpose at all in anything she did?
No, the impression she gave me was that she was killing time. Professor von Dusen was silent for several minutes.
I think perhaps, he began.
But what he thought Hatch did not learn, for he was sent away with additional instructions. Next morning found him watching the front of the Van Safford house again. Mrs. Van Safford came out at 7 minutes past 8 o'clock and walked rapidly eastward. She turned the first corner and went on, still rapidly, to a corner of the alley. There she paused and took a quick look behind her and went in. Hatch was some distance back and ran forward just in time to see her skirts trailing into the door. Ah, here's something anyhow, he told himself with grim satisfaction. He walked down the alley to the door. It was like all the other doors along that led to a black hall of a house, and was intended for the use of delivery wagons. When he examined the door, he scratched his chin thoughtfully. Then came utter bewilderment. An amazing sense of hopeless insanity, for there, staring at him in the doorplate, was the name Von Safford. She had merely come out the front door and gone in at the back. Hatch started to rap and ask some questions, then changed his mind and walked again to the front of the house and the steps up. "Is Miss Von Safford in?" he inquired of Baxter, who opened the door. "No, sir. She went out a few minutes ago." Hatch stared at him coldly a minute, then walked away. "Now this is a singularly savory kettle of fish," he soliloquized. "She's either gone back into the house without his knowledge, or else he has been bribed. And then he took the story to Professor von Dusen. The imperturbable man of science listened to the end, and then arose. Oh, he said 3 times, which was interesting to Hatch in that it showed the end was in sight, but it was not at all illuminating. He was still floundering. The thinking machine started to an adjoining room, then turned back.
"By the way, Mr. Hatch," he answered, "did you happen to find out what was the matter with Miss Blakely?"
"By George, I forgot that," returned the reporter ruefully.
"Never mind, I'll find out."
At 11 o'clock, Hutchison Hatch and the thinking machine called at the Van Safford home. Mr. Van Safford in person received them, and there was a gleam of hope in his face at the sight of the diminutive scientist. Hatch was introduced then.
"You don't know of any other Van Saffords in this block," began the scientist.
"There's no other family in the city," was the reply. "Why?"
"Is your wife in now?"
"No, she went out this morning as usual."
"Now, Mr. Von Safford, I'll tell you how you may bring a matter to the end, and understand it all at once. Go upstairs to the wife's apartment. They're probably locked, and call her. She won't answer, but she'll hear you. Then tell her you understand it all and that you're sorry. She'll hear that, and that alone is what she has been waiting to hear for some time. When she comes out, bring her downstairs. Believe me, I should be delighted to meet so clever a woman."
Mr. Von Safford was looking at him as if he was doubting his sanity. "Really," he said coldly, "what sort of child's play is this?"
"It's the only way you'll ever coax her out of her room," snapped Professor Von Dusen belligerently, "and you'd better do it gracefully."
"I've
Perfectly serious." "She has merely been going out the front door every day and coming back in the back, of necessity to fool not ran. That is what she did the day you ran after her and she disappeared."
Mr. Von Safford listened in amazement. Von Dusen,
That's for you to answer. A little less time at your club in the evenings, and a little less of a selfish amusement, so that you can pay attention to a beautiful woman who was, previous to her marriage at least, been accustomed to constant attention. Would solve a little domestic problem. You've spent every evening at your club for months, and she has been here alone probably a great part of that time. In your own selfishness, you've never thought of her. She gave you a reason to think of her.
Suddenly, Mr. von Safford turned and ran out of the room. They heard him as he took the stairs, 2 at a time. By George, remarked Hatch, that's a silly ending to a crackling good mystery, isn't it? 10 minutes later, Mr. and Mrs. van Safford entered the room. Her pretty face was suffused with color. He was frankly outrageously happy. There were mutual introductions.
It was perfectly dreadful of Mr. von Safford to call on you gentlemen to this affair.
Mrs. van Safford apologized charmingly.
Really, I feel very much ashamed of myself for...
There is no consequence, madam,
Professor von Dusen assured her.
It's the first opportunity I've ever had to study a woman's mind. It was not at all logical, but it was very, very instructive. I may add that it was effective, too.
He bowed low and, turning, picked up his hat. But your fee, suggested Mr. von Safford. Professor von Dusen squinted at him sourly.
Oh, yes, my fee, he mused. That will be $5,000.
5,000 what?
Exclaimed Mr. von Safford.
$5,000,
repeated the scientist.
Why, man, it's perfectly absurd to talk...
Mrs. von Safford laid one white hand on her husband's arm. He glanced at her, and she smiled radiantly.
Don't you think I'm worth it, then?
She asked archly. He wrote the check. The professor inscribed his name across the back in a crabbed little hand and passed it on to Hatch.
Please hand that to some charitable organization, he directed. It was as good an excellent lesson, Mrs. von Safford. Good day.
Professor von Dusen, scientist, and Hudson Hatch, reporter, walked along side by side for 2 blocks without speaking. The reporter broke the silence. Why did you want to know what was the matter with Miss Blakesley? He asked.
Her name was mentioned, and I still wanted to know if she was really ill, or was merely attempting to mislead Mr. von Safford, was the reply. She had a touch of grippe. I got that by the phone. I also learned that Mr. von Safford's club habits by the phone of his club.
And those women who left, what was the joke?
The fact that they laughed made me see that the affair was not a serious one. They were intimate friends with whom the wife had evidently discussed doing just what she did. All sorts of possibilities were suggested to me, but everything considered in this case, the facts could only have been that the logic developed them. I imagined the true state of the affairs from your report of Miss Van Safford's day of wandering. When I knew that she went to the back door of her own house, I saw the solution. I saw it, Mr. Hatch.
And the scientist paused and shook a long finger at the reporter's face.
Because 2 and 2 are always 4, not sometimes, but all the time.